Look, that Old West you saw in the movies, total fantasy. The truth is, those famous gunslingers didn't go down in dramatic noon duels. A lot of them died of illness, got shot in the back by people they called friends, or ended up old and broke in some forgotten corner. These are 18 real fates Hollywood never had the guts to show. Number 1. William Cody built an entertainment empire that changed the way the world saw the American West. For decades, he took his traveling show through cities across Europe and the Americas, putting on shootouts, horse races, and staged battles for millions of people. Kings and queens watched his performances. Presidents shook his hand. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most recognized figures on the planet at the end of the 19th century. But when the curtain came down for the last time, reality looked very different. In January 1917, Cody died at his sister's house in Denver with practically no money in his pocket. Business had gone bad, investments failed, and the man who once commanded fortunes passed away depending on the generosity of family members. But the story doesn't end there. His body sat for 6 months waiting to be buried while debates went on about his final resting place. He was embalmed over and over during that time. When they finally buried him on Lookout Mountain in Colorado, the people of Cody, Wyoming, were furious. The town that carries his name claimed Denver had basically kidnapped his remains. That dispute dragged on through entire generations. To calm things down and prevent any attempt at an unauthorized transfer, Colorado authorities took a radical step. They poured tons of concrete over the grave. To this day, some people in Wyoming insist the real Buffalo Bill is resting somewhere else, and that the grave on the mountain holds nothing but a fake. A guy who spent his life creating spectacles ended up himself at the center of a mystery nobody ever managed to settle for good. Number 2. Bat Masterson. You've probably heard that name in some Western movie or TV show, but this guy's real story is even more impressive than the fiction. In the 1870s and 1880s, Dodge City was seen as one of the most dangerous towns in American territory. That's where cowboys drove cattle after long journeys. And when they got there, they wanted to blow their money on whiskey, gambling, and trouble. Masterson took on the job of keeping order in a place where the law didn't mean much, and a pistol settled almost everything. He was in armed shootouts, arrested wanted criminals, and built a reputation that crossed borders. But what happened next is the part that surprises people. At some point, Masterson decided he was tired of that life. He put the guns away, bought a train ticket, and headed east. He ended up settling in New York, where he started a completely different career. He began writing about boxing for the Morning Telegraph, covering fights and interviewing fighters. The man who used to settle disputes with a revolver now made his living with words. The change was so drastic that a lot of New Yorkers had no idea who he'd been decades earlier. On October 25th, 1921, Masterson was at his desk, writing yet another column about the fight world. He was 67 years old. Without any warning, his heart stopped. He slumped over the papers he was writing. The gunslinger who had survived shootouts and ambushes met his end in the quietest way you can imagine, doing exactly what he loved. Number 3. Wyatt Earp, 1923. Here's a guy who was part of the most famous shootout in American history, the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. And he was still around 42 years later. Think about that for a second. While most men who lived by the gun died by the gun, this guy made it through decades and ended up in Los Angeles. And what was he doing there? Trying to convince Hollywood to tell his story the right way. Earp showed up on film sets almost every day, talked with directors, and gave tips to young actors on how a real man drew a gun. Those guys were blown away because they were getting lessons from someone who had actually lived all of it. The detail most people don't know is that he never got a single penny for that consulting work, not one. The old marshal was basically broke in the last years of his life. When he died in January 1929, at 80 years old, something interesting happened at the funeral. Hollywood Western actors, the same ones he had helped for free, were the ones who carried his coffin. Tom Mix, who was one of the biggest movie stars at the time, was photographed crying. William S. Hart, another Western star, was also there paying his respects. These men who played heroes on the big screen were burying a real hero. And there's one more thing worth mentioning. Of the men who took part in the gunfight at the OK Corral that day, in October 1881, Wyatt was the only one who didn't take a single bullet. His brothers were shot. His enemies died. He walked away without a scratch and lived almost 5 more decades after that. Number 4. Doc Holliday, 1887. You've probably heard of this guy, but I bet you don't know how he really ended up here. John Henry Holliday was born in Georgia in 1851, the son of a well-respected family that invested heavily in his education. The kid graduated in dentistry in Philadelphia when he was just 20, set up for a quiet life fixing smiles. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything: tuberculosis. The doctors were blunt and said he only had a few months left. Instead of waiting for death to show up, Doc packed his things and headed west, betting that the dry desert air might buy him more time. The bet worked, at least partly. But out in the wild territories, a skinny, coughing dentist didn't draw much business. Doc found that his steady hands were better used for playing cards and handling revolvers. He got famous at the poker tables and built a reputation as someone you didn't want to mess with. The moment that locked his name into history happened in Tombstone, Arizona, in October 1881. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted about 30 seconds and left 3 men dead on the ground. Doc fought alongside Wyatt Earp and his brothers against the cowboys and barely made it out alive. After that, tuberculosis kept taking its toll. Doc drank heavily to deal with the pain and the sleepless nights. When he finally ended up in a sanatorium in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, he was so eaten up by the disease, he could hardly recognize himself. The story goes that he looked at his own bare feet before he died and said it was funny. The man had always been sure he'd die with his boots on, in a brawl or a duel. The disease had other plans. Number 5. When you look at this woman holding a gun, you need to understand one thing first. Annie Oakley was born Phoebe Ann Moses in 1860 in a log cabin in Ohio, in a county so poor it barely showed up on maps. Her father died when she was 6, leaving the family in total poverty. At 8 years old, while other kids were playing, she picked up her father's rifle and started hunting. Not for sport, for survival. The family was truly starving. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. Annie sold the game she brought down to local restaurants and hotels. Rabbits, quail, pheasants, anything that moved turned into money. And with that money, she did something that sounds impossible. Before she turned 15, Annie had paid off the entire mortgage on her mother's farm. A teenager paid a debt that adults couldn't figure out. In 1881, a pro shooter named Frank Butler came to Cincinnati, betting $100 that nobody in the city could beat him. Someone bet that a 21-year-old girl could. Annie hit 25 shots in a row. Butler missed the last one. A year after that loss, they got married. The man who lost to her never competed against anyone again. He became his own wife's manager and assistant. For 50 years, they worked together in Buffalo Bill's show, where Annie shot coins tossed in the air and cigarette ashes out of volunteers' mouths, queens and presidents paid to watch. In November 1926, Annie died at 66. Frank Butler, who hadn't spent a single day away from her since they married, simply stopped eating. 18 days later, he died too. They were buried side by side in Greenville, Ohio, on the same poor land where it all began. Number 6. That young face belongs to someone who became one of the most well-known figures of the American Old West before he even turned 22. Henry McCarty, who the world would come to know as Billy the Kid, lost his mother as a teenager and started a life of crime early. By 15, he was already in trouble with the law for petty theft. From there, his path only escalated. Records from the time claim he killed 21 people, matching his age when he died. Modern historians dispute that number and believe it was probably between 4 and 9. But here's what nobody argues. The kid had an incredible ability to get out of impossible situations. In April 1881, he was locked up at the Lincoln County Courthouse, waiting to be executed by hanging. He managed to slip out of his handcuffs, grabbed a guard's gun, and killed 2 men during the escape. He simply walked out of the building while the whole town watched. Sheriff Pat Garrett had a complicated history with Billy. The two knew each other from the days when they hung out in the same saloons in Fort Sumner. Some accounts suggest they played cards together. When Garrett was ordered to capture his old acquaintance, the hunt lasted for months. On the night of July 14th, 1881, Garrett was hiding in the dark bedroom of a house in Fort Sumner. Billy walked into the room without knowing who was there. He asked in Spanish who it was. Garrett fired twice in the dark. The young man, who had become the territory's most wanted criminal, dropped before he could react. He wasn't armed at that moment. He was only 21, but his name was already permanently etched into American history. Number 7. Davy Crockett. You probably grew up hearing stories about this guy with a coonskin cap on his head. Hollywood turned him into a cartoon hero, but the real story is way more interesting and complicated than any movie ever showed. Crockett was born in Tennessee in 1786 into a poor family. His dad ran a roadside tavern, and the kid barely set foot in a classroom. At 13, he ran away from home to avoid a beating and spent years working on farms out in the countryside. When he came back, he was basically a grown man. He became a well-known bear hunter in the area. People say he killed over 100 in a single year. Then he became a soldier in the wars against the Creek Indians, serving under Andrew Jackson. But it was in politics that his life really got interesting. Crockett was elected to the U.S. Congress 3 times, representing Tennessee and Washington. There, he got into it hard with that same Andrew Jackson, who was now president. Crockett voted against bills Jackson wanted passed and wasn't afraid to say what he thought. When he lost re-election in 1835, he told the people of Tennessee they could go to hell because he was going to Texas, and he did. In February 1836, Crockett arrived at the Alamo with a group of volunteers. The fort had fewer than 200 defenders facing thousands of Mexican soldiers under General Santa Anna. On March 6th, after 13 days of siege, the Mexicans attacked before dawn. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, and pretty much all the defenders died. Crockett was 49. Now here's the part people still argue about today. Some accounts say he fought until he fell. Others claim he was captured alive and executed afterward on Santa Anna's orders. A diary from a Mexican officer discovered decades later fueled that controversy. What happened that morning still divides historians. Number 8. Jesse James built a reputation that haunted the American Midwest for almost 2 decades. Bankers would lock their vaults with shaking hands when they heard rumors his gang was in the area. Railroad companies spent fortunes hiring Pinkerton detectives, trying to catch him. The man became a legend while he was still alive, with newspapers exaggerating his exploits and some even painting him as a kind of modern Robin Hood. But here's the detail that changes everything. Jesse didn't get taken down in some dramatic ambush or die trading shots with the law. On April 3rd, 1882, he was inside his own home in St. Joseph, Missouri, living under a fake name with his wife and 2 young kids. He was only 34 and was planning one more robbery. That morning, 2 brothers Jesse had taken in as trusted partners were visiting. Bob Ford, the younger one, was carrying a heavy secret. Weeks earlier, he'd secretly met with Governor Thomas Crittenden and made a deal. In exchange for killing or capturing Jesse, Ford would get a pardon for his own crimes and a $10,000 reward, an amount that today would be worth more than $300,000. When Jesse turned his back to straighten a picture frame on the living room wall, Ford saw his chance. He pulled his revolver and fired a single shot into the back of the most wanted man in America's head. Jesse died instantly. The murder turned into a national scandal. A lot of people saw Ford as a coward for shooting an unarmed man in the back, someone who trusted him. A popular ballad at the time said Ford was a dirty little coward who shot poor Jesse. Ford himself never managed to escape that shadow, and he ended his days being despised wherever he went. Number 9. You've probably heard of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but the real story goes way beyond what Hollywood showed. These 2 guys built something nobody had seen before in the Old West, a criminal operation that ran almost like a business. The Wild Bunch wasn't your typical gang of disorganized outlaws. They had planning, escape routes set up ahead of time, and fresh horses waiting at strategic spots. For years, banks and trains were hit systematically, and the authorities just couldn't keep up. Pinkerton, the most feared detective agency of the time, put its best men on the case. Even so, the duo got away every time. When the heat finally got too intense in the U.S., Cassidy and Sundance made a decision that showed how differently they thought from other outlaws. Instead of hiding out in some remote corner of the country, they crossed continents. They ended up in Patagonia, Argentina, where they bought a ranch and tried to live like regular citizens. But old habits die hard. Before long, they were back to robbing again, now on South American soil. In November 1908, in the small Bolivian town of San Vicente, their luck ran out. Local soldiers surrounded the place where they were hiding after a mine robbery. The shootout was brutal. When the smoke cleared, 2 bodies were lying there. Bolivian authorities declared the case closed. Sundance supposedly died from gunfire, and Cassidy supposedly used the last bullet on himself. End of the line for America's most wanted outlaws. But there's a problem with that whole story. Nobody ever managed to prove for sure that those bodies were really them. In the decades that followed, people in different U.S. states swore they'd seen one or the other alive. Some even claimed they'd talked to them. Relatives insisted, until the end of their lives, that the 2 came back and lived quietly under fake names. The truth is, we'll never know for sure what happened that night in Bolivia. Number 10. 2 days before turning 41, Belle Starr was riding back home in Oklahoma's Indian Territory. It was February 1889, and the road was way too quiet. Someone was waiting, hidden in the brush along the trail. 2 shotgun blasts hit her in the back and knocked her off her horse. But the killer wasn't satisfied. He walked up to her fallen body and fired one more time, this time in the face. The brutality of that last shot tells a story all by itself. Whoever did it wanted to be absolutely sure Belle wouldn't survive. Or maybe they wanted her not to be recognized. The case was never solved, and the list of suspects is long. Her own son, Edgar Reed, was at the top. Days earlier, Belle had found out he stole a neighbor's horse and decided to teach the boy a public lesson. She beat him in front of other people, a humiliation men back then didn't forget easily. The neighbor, Edgar Watson, also had reasons. The two fought bitterly over land boundaries, and Watson already had trouble with the law in other states. Belle Starr wasn't an ordinary woman by 19th century standards. She married twice to men wanted by the law. Her first husband, Jim Reed, was a horse thief and robber. The second, Sam Starr, was Cherokee and also lived on the wrong side of the law. Their farm worked as a stopover for fugitives who needed to disappear for a while. Jesse James supposedly stopped by more than once. Newspapers at the time turned Belle into a larger-than-life character. They called her the Bandit Queen and ran exaggerated stories about her adventures. The truth is, she knew a lot of dangerous people's secrets, and people like that tend to rack up enemies without even realizing it. Number 11, Wild Bill Hickok. You've probably heard of the dead man's hand in poker, right? Well, that phrase was born because of this guy. James Butler. Hickok wasn't someone you wanted trouble with. He worked as a sharpshooter during the Civil War, then became a sheriff and marshal in some of the most violent towns in American territory. His reputation was so heavy that a lot of gunslingers would rather leave town when they knew he was around. But here's the detail few people know. Wild Bill suffered from an eye disease that was gradually destroying his vision. Some historians believe he already knew his days as a lawman were numbered. Maybe that's why he threw himself into poker so much in his last years, and it was at a card table that his fate was sealed. In August 1876, Hickok was in a saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. The place was packed that afternoon. For the first time on record, he made a basic survival mistake. He sat with his back to the door. For a man with the list of enemies he had, that was basically an invitation for disaster. Jack McCall, a guy Bill had beaten and publicly humiliated in a card game the day before, walked into the place. Without saying a word, he went up to Wild Bill and fired a shot into the back of his head. Hickok died instantly. When his body slumped over the table, the cards he was holding spilled onto the floor. It was two pair, aces and eights. Ever since that day, any poker player who gets that combo knows exactly what they're holding. Number 12, Calamity Jane. Martha Jane. Cannery was born around 1856 in Missouri and lost her parents while she was still a teenager. From that point on, she had to fend for herself in a world that didn't offer many options for women without family or money. Jane learned to ride, shoot, and survive out in wild country. During the 1870s, she worked as a civilian scout for military expeditions on the Great Plains. She traveled through areas where the presence of hostile tribes made every trip a real risk. That experience shaped her tough personality, and her fame started to grow. Here's a curious part of the story. Jane loved telling stories about her adventures, but a lot of those tales were exaggerated or completely made up. She claimed she'd been Wild Bill Hickok's lover, the famous gunslinger. But historians who studied both their lives never found solid proof of that romance. It might have been true. It might have been her fantasy. Nobody really knows for sure to this day. What's documented without a doubt is that Jane had a complicated relationship with drinking. Alcoholism followed her for decades and slowly wrecked her health. In her last years, she took part in Old West shows, including performances with Buffalo Bill Cody. She made some money, but spent almost all of it on whiskey. In August 1903, pneumonia finished her off at 51. Her body was already worn down by alcohol. Now, here's the detail people still argue about. They buried Jane right next to Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood, South Dakota's cemetery. Some locals said she'd always asked to be buried near him. Others swore it was a joke by the local grave diggers. Number 13, Pat Garrett built his whole reputation on one single moment. In July 1881, he cornered Billy the Kid in a dark room in Fort Sumner and fired 2 shots that turned a young criminal into an American legend. Garrett became a celebrated sheriff, wrote a book about the manhunt, and seemed headed for a quiet life of respect and recognition. But the Old West rarely handed out happy endings for its main characters. Over the following decades, Garrett watched his fame turn into a burden. He lost elections, racked up debts, and got involved in business deals that went bad. By the time he turned 50, the man who had taken down the territory's most wanted outlaw was broke and bitter. In February 1908, Garrett was riding in a wagon along a dusty road near Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was fighting over control of a piece of land with a rancher named Wayne Brazel. The 2 men had been arguing for months about cattle and leasing. That morning, Garrett stepped down from the wagon to relieve his bladder on the side of the road. It was his last act in life. A bullet went through the back of his head. Brazel admitted to the shooting and was put on trial weeks later. His lawyer argued self-defense, claiming Garrett had threatened to draw first. The jury deliberated for less than 15 minutes and found Brazel not guilty. Nobody questioned how a man gets shot in the back of the head while defending himself face to face. Investigators and historians spent decades trying to put that puzzle together. Some point to influential ranchers who wanted Garrett out of the way. Others suggest a hired gun was hiding nearby, and Brazel just took the blame in exchange for protection. What remains is the brutal irony of it all. The man who had chased criminals for years ended up taken out in the same cowardly way he condemned so often. Number 14. John Wesley Hardin had a reputation that made even seasoned men cross the street so they wouldn't have to pass him. Born in Texas in 1853, the son of a Methodist preacher, he went down a path nobody expected. Before he even turned 16, he already had blood on his hands. The first man he killed was a former slave, during a fight that escalated way too fast. From there, the count only went up. Historians still argue the numbers today, but estimates put it somewhere between 20 and 40 deaths. One story that made the rounds a lot said he shot a guy through a hotel wall because the man's snoring wouldn't let him sleep. True or exaggerated, that kind of story shows how his name became a synonym for danger. The Texas Rangers chased Hardin for years until they finally captured him in Florida in 1877. He served 16 years in prison, where he spent his time studying law. When he got out in 1894, he swore he'd left that life behind. He even got a license to practice law. But the past has a way of collecting its debts. Hardin moved to El Paso, trying to rebuild his life. Still, old habits stuck. He drank hard, gambled, and got mixed up with complicated people. On the night of August 19th, 1895, he was in a saloon called the Acme, shooting dice on the bar. John Selman, a local constable with his own history of violence, came in through the back door. What happened next took seconds. Selman pulled his gun and fired. Hardin dropped dead right there, with no chance to react. The gunslinger, who supposedly faced down dozens of armed men, ended his days at 42, shot in the back by someone he may not have even seen coming. Number 15. The outlaw who left poems at the crime scenes. Between 1875 and 1883, a guy named Charles Bowles managed to do something that seems impossible. He robbed 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches in Northern California without ever pulling the trigger a single time. His method was always the same. He'd show up in the middle of the road, wearing a flour sack over his head, with holes cut out for the eyes. He'd point an unloaded shotgun at the driver and tell everyone to stay quiet. He'd take only the company's strong box and then walk off into the mountains. He never took a penny from the passengers, but what really drove the authorities crazy was something else. After a few robberies, he started leaving handwritten poems inside the emptied money boxes. The verses mocked Wells Fargo and were signed with the name Black Bart. Newspapers back then loved printing them, and the guy became a kind of celebrity. The company spent a fortune hiring detectives to find this crime poet. For 8 years, he dodged every trap. You know what finally brought him down? A handkerchief. In 1883, during a robbery that went wrong, Bart dropped a handkerchief with a San Francisco laundry mark. Investigators traced it back to a customer named Charles Bolton. When they arrested the man, they found out he was 54, a Civil War veteran, and dressed like a respectable gentleman. He confessed to everything and got 4 years in prison. He got out in 1888 and just vanished from history. Some people say he went to New York to start a new life. Others still swear to this day that Wells Fargo started paying him a monthly pension so he'd never rob their stagecoaches again. The truth is, nobody ever found out what happened to Black Bart after he left prison. Number 16, Bass Reeves. This guy was born as someone else's property in Arkansas around 1838. Think about that for a second. A human being who legally belonged to another human being. During the Civil War, he managed to escape and disappeared into Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. He lived for years among native tribes, learned their languages, and memorized every trail and hiding place in that wild region. When the war ended, the federal government had a serious problem. That territory became a refuge for every kind of outlaw, murderer, and horse thief. It was no man's land. The feds needed someone who knew every rock, every river, every hole where a criminal could hide. And who knew it better than the guy who'd survived there for years? In 1875, Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, gave Reeves a badge as a deputy U.S. Marshal. A formerly enslaved man was now hunting down white men who thought the law didn't exist. For more than 30 years, this man arrested over 3,000 outlaws. 3,000. Read that number again. He was 6'2", rode like nobody else, and had a level of aim criminals swore was the devil's work. He used disguises nobody saw coming, showing up where they least expected him. He got into shootouts against whole gangs and never took a single bullet. The most impressive part? When he found out his own son had committed murder, he went after him himself and arrested the boy. Many researchers today believe his stories inspired the Lone Ranger character. In January 1910, in Muskogee, Oklahoma, at 71 years old, he died of kidney problems. He started life being hunted and ended it as the greatest manhunter the Old West ever knew. Number 17, Tom Horn. That name might not mean anything to you right now, but this guy lived so many different lives, it feels like something out of a movie. He started out as a U.S. Army scout in the 1880s, helping track the legendary Geronimo through the mountains of Arizona. Then he became a Pinkerton agent with the most feared detective agency of the time. But it was in Wyoming that his story got truly dark. Big cattle barons hired Horn to deal with a problem the law couldn't handle, thieves who kept stealing their herds. And when we say deal with it, we're not talking about arresting anyone. Horn had his own method. The targets would just turn up dead, always with a rock placed under their head. That was his signature, a silent warning to anyone thinking about messing with his employers. The dirty work went on for years, until something happened in July 1901 that changed everything. A 14-year-old boy named Willie Nickel was found shot in the back near his family's ranch. The boy's father had issues with powerful neighbors. Horn was in the area when the murder happened. Months later, a deputy invited Horn to drink and talk. After a lot of whiskey, Horn supposedly confessed that he was the one who pulled the trigger. When he sobered up, he said he'd made it up, that it was just drunk talk. The jury didn't buy that explanation. In November 1903, Tom Horn walked up to the gallows in Cheyenne, swearing he was innocent until the very last second. More than a century later, historians still argue over whether he really killed that boy or if the real killers used his reputation to slip away from justice. Number 18. In 1899, a woman under 30 did something no man had the guts to do back then. Pearl Hart held up a stagecoach in the middle of Arizona and took all the passengers' money. It might not sound like much today, but at the time it was basically suicide. Stagecoaches were already being replaced by trains, and the outlaws who still tried that kind of job usually ended up with a bullet in their head before sunset. Pearl not only managed to get away at first, she made headlines in newspapers all over the country. The American public couldn't believe a woman had planned and pulled off a robbery like that. During the trial, she played on that disbelief. She told the jury that the laws were made by men and that she shouldn't be judged by them. The first jury acquitted her, probably because the men couldn't accept that this small woman was capable of a crime like that. The judge was furious and ordered a new trial with a different charge. This time she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But here's the part nobody talks about. After she got out, Pearl basically vanished for decades. Some researchers say she married a rancher and lived quietly in rural Arizona. Others claim she kept up a low-level life of crime. What we do know for sure is that she died in 1955 at 84, pretty much forgotten. Hollywood built the image of the Old West outlaw as a man who died young in dramatic shootouts. Pearl Hart shattered that stereotype by simply living. She was the last person to rob a stagecoach in the Old West, and she died of old age, peacefully, while America had already forgotten that women were part of that violent history too.